All right, now this second round is going to be on decarbonization. And I'd love to invite up Bud, Randy, Andreas, Deanna, and Klaus to talk about zero emissions fuels, de-risking first movers, the carbon levy, closing the competitiveness gap by scaling, and demand drivers. Welcome. All right, Bud, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Great. Well, I'm really happy to say we had a very good and short discussion, and the answer is magic beans. Thank you. Oh, wait, no, that was the dream I had last night. I'm sorry. So I just wanted to walk you through a little bit of our discussion, and those of you that maybe swim in the same normal fishbowl that I do, find yourself in this discussion kind of over and over again. I don't think a week goes by when I'm not involved in a serious discussion about this topic of how do we get a zero emission fuel or series of zero emission fuels. And I think that second point, the plural, is very important because not all ships are the same, they don't deploy the same, they don't operate the same. There's probably going to be a combination of solutions here in the solution set that actually solve this problem for us. So we focused on four main factors, and that is zero emission fuel or fuels needs to be safe, reliable, cost effective, and available by 2030. And we picked 2030 for reasons that'll be pretty obvious. There's been a lot of reference to that maybe you need the first zero emission ships to be ready by 2030 in order to have any chance to get where we all think we really need to be by 2050 and beyond. So our discussion focused on, first of all, how we would make more progress than we do in these other conversations, because they all kind of tend to end up in a roadblock. And we realized that one of those roadblocks that's really substantial is the unknown when it comes to most of us in this room and most of the people that I work with on a regular basis. And that is the upstream part, where the fuel might come from, what it might price at, whether or not the scale is going to be there, are not things we typically control. We're not experts in that. And so we pretty quickly identified that if we want to make genuine progress, we have to focus on other stakeholders, the energy producers, and also the petrochemical producers as well, because some of the solution set may come from them. So I'll get back to that in a moment, but basically there were two general framings that we thought these sources could come from. One is a biomass type of solution, and another one that relies on electricity to actually produce the fuel solution. And then how you would apply that is first of all, there has to be an energy supply that's available, keeping in mind a fuel is nothing but a vehicle to hold energy, and then you withdraw it through some sort of conversion mechanism, whether that's a diesel engine or a fuel cell, doesn't really matter. And that second part really is important too, because the transition of the end users, the ship owners and operators, relies on a technical piece as well. It doesn't do any good to have a fuel that theoretically can hold a lot of energy if you can't unlock it through something the end user, a ship owner, can actually use on a ship. So we had some discussion about that. We looked at a couple of profiles that have to be taken into consideration. One is risk, and that's both economic and safety risks, because that's an important factor as well on the safety side. The ship profile, how they operate, what they look like, how they're designed, and maybe the age, because you may come up with different solutions for new ships than for existing ships. And then the cost profile, because at the end of the day, if we can't make this work economically, we don't have ships. We don't have this conversation at all. We've somehow got to make it fit together in a way where the economic end users of our service can afford to pay for it, because that's the way this, in the end, will have to work, or we're not in the business of shipping. We're in something else that I really don't understand. So how can we really do that? We thought we could utilize the existing Getting to Zero coalition. We think that's a really good start of stakeholders, and what we thought we would suggest is that we could set up a subgroup from that would have two basic tracks. And the one track would be to look at the technical feasibility, leveraging off work that the classification societies have already done. And if we can find a way for them to collaborate on some of the work they've got as far as, what can actually work with both existing propulsion technology and those things that maybe could be within reach in the kind of time frame we need. And then also in doing that work, we're certain that they've also had a look at the range of fuels that are realistically available right now. We thought that would be a very good stepping off point to the second part, the second track of that subgroup's work, which would be looking at what is really going to be potentially available. And that is where it's really important that we have the upstream people that are actually going to produce a fuel. Only they know what they really are likely to produce, what kind of volumes they could produce it in. And this is where maybe at the implementation stage, it needs to connect with some of the other work that's been done, because what sort of financial incentives might be required in order for them to produce something useful in the quantity that we need in advance of genuine market demand. There may be a catalyst that's necessary on their side. Maybe a pun was intended, but it was unintentional, a catalyst to actually, generate the production before the natural marketplace would say, yeah, we'll take everything that you can make. So just to summarize, we're a long, long ways from having a solution, although I wish it was the magic beans. And we do have a way forward where we think we can progress the work intersessionally between now and the next session of the Global Maritime Forum using the Getting to Zero Coalition and setting up a subgroup there with some additional stakeholders. Thank you.
Bud, thank you. Actually, go to keep it. I think you gave us more than magic beans, actually, and I found a lot of practicality in what your group put forth, in part because you were looking to leverage existing networks that were already proven. So working through the Getting to Zero Coalition and the known stakeholders there. And then in the two subgroups that you identified, exploring the technical feasibility, but looking at the work that's already been done. So engaging with the experts that are producing the research on how this is all going to come about, aligning with what they see happening, but then also working more closely with the upstream producers to see what will realistically be available. And I was actually, the cost effectiveness, safe, reliable, cost effective, available by 2030. You're right, the cost effective, that's going to be sort of the key that unlocks our use of this. And I guess the question that I have for you is, you talked about, well, what financial incentives in advance of genuine market demand could help unlock this? And is there a non-financial incentive that we might be able to use? Because in a sense, we're trying to get the access to these fuels before there is that genuine market demand financial incentive. Is there a non-financial incentive that we should be exploring?
Yeah, I have to say I have to freelance because it was beyond the scope of our actual discussion, but I do think that that's possible. And I think when you look at the nature of the holistic type of businesses that energy companies are typically in today,
Yeah.
I think that there's all sorts of possibilities to incentivize them to promote more research and development, quicker access to markets, larger scale production than naturally it would. I remember when we were, back when I was on the government benches at IMO, and we were working on the 2020 regulations back in 2007, 2008, there was this huge question of what are you going to do with this 7 to 12 year pipeline, if you will, of time that it takes to build additional capacity. Well, it turns out I didn't really need a lot of that because they ended up with a different solution they figured out on their own. And it turned out to be blended fuels rather than just more distillation.
Yeah.
If we can turn them loose and all of their collective thought on it, I'm sure they can find solutions faster than those of us outside looking in, and they know what it would take to motivate them to do something in advance of the market demand really being there.
I would say also that being contacted by this industry, this collaborative industry, signaling we're interested in this, would actually further incentivize them to work faster or harder to get at the end game there. So
I agree, and I think that's happening already. I think it's going to be difficult to have one single message on that, but I do think that you're seeing more and more ship owners express that they want to be part of the solution here. They really do, but it's not a problem we can solve on our own. And I think the more we deliver that message, the more they'll be inclined to get ahead of the demand curve.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bud. Let's next turn to Randy to talk about de-risking first movers.
Thank you very much, Bud, because I think the magic beans that you started is something that we'll try to continue through this decarbonization session. The reason why magic beans is very appropriate when you start with zero emission fuels is that you hit them on something that we spent a lot of time on in our group, which is that the catalyst for change is not just among the people in this room. All the various interests that we represent, whether they be shipbuilders or equipment providers or insurance providers, and of course you have ship owners and operators, but also the energy providers. Because we've already seen an example of IMO 2020 when there is confusion that hasn't been cut through or clarified by us as an industry collectively with the IMO, that ultimately the energy providers are not in a position to give us a very clear pathway to a future. And this is a future that is a decarbonized future that is even more amorphous than anything we've ever seen. So for us, where we started was that we need to make sure that all the value chain, all the members in the value chain are not just members of coalition of what we call the willing, but really it is the coalition of the necessary if we're going to get to a decarbonized future. And but what we mean by that is only through this type of coalition where there's enough will can we have an adequate dialogue with the IMO outlining the exact steps, the framework, the legal framework that is necessary so that we can facilitate adequate explicit financial subsidies as well as implicit in-kind subsidies to allow first movers to feel comfortable to take that first step. I'm reminded of the people who bought first electric cars. If they were done in isolation with plugs that weren't readily available, it was hard to take that leap of saying, I'm going to go out and buy an electric car. And similarly, it wasn't until you had an entity like Tesla that didn't necessarily look at financial incentives initially, but with a very long-durated vision, that you finally took that leap to say, I'm going to actually go out and buy this really fancy electric car. And so we have to look at the field of renewables as a great example of how to move forward. And so by looking at subsidies, by being able to cheapen the cost and narrow the gap between traditional sources and what we need in the decarbonized future, we'd be looking at this kind of new legal framework to allow for first movers in the form of not just ship owners, but also shipbuilders, equipment providers, as well as financial intermediaries, to then be able to get us closer to these kind of sample, kind of new Tesla type of examples that allow for people to have the comfort to take that leap into that decarbonized future. So when we talk about de-risking first movers, we have what I just said, explicit financial subsidies that could come from donor foundations, come from donor governments. It can also come from implicit government guarantees through kind of underwriting these financial obligations. But more importantly, IMO plays an important role to underpin everything through a legal framework. Because without that, we don't know what are the game rules that we're playing under.
Yeah.
And there needs to be a certain time frame involved where first movers are clearly rewarded for taking those early risks. And therefore, later on, other actors, whether they are following or at least they've decided not to follow in this framework, have very clear ground rules for what they have to pay or don't have to pay in the future.
So Randy, to get to that value chain consensus, what did your group envision? Like a small working group with representatives from across the value chain?
So it's very much the magic beans that Bud already started, which is very much using the existing groups, getting to zero coalition, and of course the Poseidon principles, which really links the financial underpinnings that will allow this investment to take place, whether it's on a first mover basis or over a longer term basis.
Excellent. And I love the overlap here of using the infrastructure relationships we currently have that are succeeding to drive forward continual change. Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's move on to Andreas with the carbon levy.
We had a big group, great discussion and concrete progress, and we started with the conceptual question, do we need a carbon levy? The clear consensus in our group is yes, it's coming and we should shape it. IMO has set the trajectory. Politicians are demanding it. this train is leaving the station. For those of you who like to think defensively, we can prevent a badly designed outcome from being imposed by shaping it ourselves. For those of you who like to think positively, we have an opportunity to reshape the industry for the future, to create new commercial opportunities, and to prevent a human calamity. Let's not be on the wrong side of history on this one. We did think about some of the objections and barriers, because it's not only us in this room, we're a self-selecting group that is trying to think about the future. There are others. And we raised questions like, why another cost for the industry? Who should pay? Where does the money go? How do we know it will produce results? How to ensure transparency? How to redeploy the funds? But we worked through these and found answers to all of them. So the first big question was price. What should the price be? And we looked at this from many angles. What is needed to fund R&D and scaling? Well, you probably only need a couple of dollars per ton of CO2 to do R&D. You need tens of dollars for scaling. We looked at what is needed to levelize with alternative fuels. Well, today you need at least $300 per ton of CO2 to levelize with ammonia. It's about $300 actually for the fuel alone. It's $80 for retrofitting, and it's even more for infrastructure, so these are big numbers. We looked at what does Paris tell us. The Paris Agreement says we need $40 to $80 per ton of CO2 by 2020, and $50 to $100 per ton by 2030. IMF is saying 75 by 2030. We looked at levels in other industries, which is $1 to $127 per ton, and we looked at the cost impact on consumers. If you take a VLCC and you pay a $33 per ton CO2 tax, and you take that VLCC with crude oil from the Middle East to Singapore, you refine it, and then you put it on an LR1 and take it to Rotterdam and charge another $33 per ton of CO2, it will cost an additional 0.002 cents per liter at the fuel pump. 0.2 cents, sorry, it's $0.002, which is 0.2 cents. Taking it all into account, we actually talked what the price should be, and the overwhelming majority felt it should be $10 per ton of CO2 as a starting level, and $50 to $75 per ton after 10 years or sometime around 2030. The third of the four areas was probably the quickest discussion, which was around collection and enforcement. We have good mechanisms in place at IMO. We can use the existing IMO data collection system to ensure compliance, because we know what bunkers people are buying. And it is currently verified by class, so it has an objective body looking at the DCS. And for collection of funds, one suggestion was we can actually use the P&I clubs, which already have a collection mechanism and issue certificates for compliance. So we have a mechanism to do that. Lastly, what do we do with the funds? So the first thing was, if we establish this fund, we suggested that it should have an objective that reads something like the following. The Maritime Green Fund will accelerate decarbonization in shipping through investments in technology and design of new propulsion systems, alternative fuels, and scaling and infrastructure to deliver these fuels, while taking into consideration the impact on trade and developing states. At $10 per ton, we're talking of CO2, we're talking about an $8 billion fund. At $75 per ton, we're talking about a $70 billion fund. These are very big numbers, which we all felt can be used when we get to scaling and infrastructure. But clearly, this needs to be attached to a supranational body to give it legitimacy. So we think it should be under the aegis of IMO, but it should have its own governance system so that it doesn't become highly bureaucratized and with all the member states getting too involved. It should have a professional management team, a board of trustees, and these could include technical and environmental experts, industry, government bodies, although not member states themselves, shipyards, engine makers, upstream fuel providers. Finally, next steps. We felt we really have to work through existing organizations, shipping associations and ICS and IMO for this, but we can create an industry coalition to ensure the conversation moves forward. Clearly there are some coalitions already, not to bypass the existing channels, but to put some wind into their sails. My last comment is that I was very encouraged that our group was not saying it's not our problem and just blaming individual consumers. It's the consumer's fault, or governments saying, well, governments should solve it, but actually saying we have a responsibility as an industry to do something. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I don't know whether to say there's a lot of mechanical cat or magical beans or whatever, but it was extremely, I think, concrete, well thought out, making use of existing infrastructure, but then also taking the funds and doing constructive, transformational things with it that we can all get behind, our industry, but also our general society as well. Thank you very much. Deanna, would love to hear from you on closing the competitiveness gap.
I'm actually going to build on everything that came before me works out well. I'm very pleased actually because we had taken a lot of the components of the decarbonization goals that we were each working towards or problems that sets that we were working towards, and we worked them into more of a systems-based approach to what we were considering being called a mission-oriented innovation approach for the industry and for outside of the industry as well. And how we decided that that should come about, or what was in the inspirational phase of that, was also these types of approaches. A good example was in the government of Norway had put out a call to innovation for anybody that was willing to work on trying to electrify or at least make ferries, zero emission ferries in Norway itself. They had specifications. They didn't care how it happened. They just wanted it to happen. Here are the specs. They needed to get to and from these different ports, be able to run at these certain times. And if you were able to do that, whomever you were, then you would have actual contracts waiting for you at the end to build the ferries and to become a part of that innovation system together with not only the government and all of the different stakeholders involved. So based on that type of mission-oriented innovation approach, we then more or less connected the dots for how we could close the competitiveness. And that is to put out an open call, a call to action from the industry itself, from the shipping sector, based on the zero emission fuels criteria. So what is it that we need? They need to be safe, reliable, cost-effective, available by 2030, assuming that's also something that the industry multilateral working groups have come up with. What are the specifications of the fuels we need for the future? To put those out as the mission, that is then more or less, another way to think of it, someone that was going by our groups had said, oh, it's the X Prize for the shipping industry. Similarly, having that call to action, to be opening up the innovation to anybody that's willing to work on this, including the current oil majors, but also to the new innovative fuels and alternatives that we might not be able to see yet in our own industry. And then taking the carbon levy funds, we have them placed conveniently in the middle of our system here. So assuming that we have a carbon levy that is also well worked out and well thought out and that has potentially $70 billion in it, for example, what do we do with that money? How do you effectualize it? And how do you then also create the longer term impact? And what we're discussing is there is a role that everybody has to play in this, that we in this room, even in our group alone, we had a lot of these stakeholders required, right? So we had the shipbuilders, we had the ship owners and operators, we had the banks, we had the governments, we had IMO representatives, port representatives. So how do you then take all of the different roles that we each have to play and create the commitments that are required for the longer term take-up of these fuels once they're created, as well as the funds for scaling, which is another mention point for the levy. And from there, building that system is a lot harder than just, I mean, that's already very complex. You have several actors that have to make commitments. You have innovation that needs to be spurred and de-risked, as was your, I think that's another very important step in that process. If you can de-risk that innovation, if you have the funds for scaling later, and if you're able to also set the criteria for that, for the fuels themselves, those are very crucial components. And the next one, the industry needs to make commitments they're willing to stick to. That commitment changes from stakeholder to stakeholder. Shipbuilders have to commit to building the new ships or the propulsion requirements that are going to be needed for it to meet the fuels or the new solutions. Ship owners, operators, and vessel owners, operators need to commit to buying said fuels. Financiers can commit to, for example, subsidization programs or financing some of the different scaling objectives that need to be required. Ports need to come back down to incentives that we've been discussing here too. So other than even monetary incentives, you know, are ports willing to say priority docking will be given to those using these fuels or exploring other incentives? Of course, this has to be sanctioned by and potentially also run by a subsector of the IMO, but it needs to be on a global level. And lastly, but not last but not least, how do you connect that to the other supporting sectors and industries that need to be involved? And that is the energy industry in general. That is also the science and technology industries and innovation. And it's also the consumers. So we all have a role to play. This is a bigger system. And how can we connect the dots between all of these systems to essentially disperse these funds, to allocate them? And lastly, we recognized and had a lot of critical discussion surrounding how long do we keep subsidies, you know, how these fuels need to be sustainable in the end. So how do you ensure that the market eventually does regulate or that the prices come down to, once they're scaled, to more affordable fuels? And how do you also make sure that this is not only dispersed properly, but that the monitoring and that the data that underpins all of this is there so that it's verifiable and proven, and that monitoring for those that are receiving funds or for those buying the fuels or for those getting the, you know, for those scaling the fuels, that it's all very much underpinning that is a very, let's say, transparent and verifiable data infrastructure, essentially. So there's a lot of complexities there, but I think in many ways it is kind of, in terms of our goal of here closing the competitiveness gap, it was a matter of connecting the dots between the various objectives that we would have in decarbonization. So I hope it wasn't too macro. It's also quite concrete. And lastly, I think it's very important to state that we very much feel, and I think what we see in the comments everybody's making in this morning and what we're talking about now is this is one of those forums wherein we have a lot of the stakeholders that can make those commitments that help to support the seriousness to these claims, the long-term ambitions of wanting to transform this sector, and furthermore, the ambitions that we're all striving towards can be followed up with commitments that we can actually negotiate and make in this very forum. And that is to be combined with the existing initiatives that are happening. So that's the role of the Global Maritime Forum in this systemic approach as well.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Deanna. I'm smiling thinking about all of the onward work that this group is going to be doing together over the next year. But if you could just, and that's the systemic approach is the right one. And it's going to take some time to build. But if you were going to zero in on what concrete steps need to be taken over the next 12 months to set us up so that we can scale when all those dots are connected, what would you focus in on?
I love that question because I forgot, and we put them on the board as well. We gave 3. So yes, we had number 1 was that we need to define the mission and the targets and the commitments, first and foremost. Secondly, it's a matter of building the fund or obtaining the governance structure, which you also mentioned, I think is very important, of the fund. Who is going to manage it, who's sanctioning it, and how is it committed, as well as the commitments from the industry to be actually committed. Because if you don't have the fund and you don't have the commitments, then the next part, which is release the global call to action, would not be necessarily believed in. So I guess 1, define the commitments, define the targets. 2, get the commitments, get the targets. And 3, make a global call to action based upon those.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Deanna. Klaus, we're going to have you bring it home for us on demand drivers and stakeholder engagement on decarbonization.
Yeah, and mainly stakeholder engagement and management. I think bringing all this home to the community and the stakeholders around us, that was what we tried to focus in on. And basically we had the conceptual thinking that in the ideal world we would achieve decarbonization by actively engaging all stakeholders, and we will all live happily and peacefully together, and we will achieve it. The perfect look of that cat, if you like, that is probably a situation where stakeholders and rules, regulations and activities of stakeholders come together so that there's a stick and there's a carrot, so that we actually in combination see a carrot for the customers, for the end consumers, not to blame them, but ultimately they are the consumers, and a stick from regulators. And the mechanics of our thinking was then to engage that community around us. There's no doubt that we saw the ship owners and charterers as the two main stakeholders. I mean, we are the ones burning the fuel, so we are at the center of attention. We are being blamed, if you like, for pollution, but not for the benefits of global trade as it is today, coming back to Gary's point on rebranding. But within that key stakeholder circle, there are also the technology providers, the manufacturers, the fuel providers, the fuel infrastructure, the banks funding the companies that are active in there. So all these need to be engaged, and you know, as you said, we are all here at the forum, but there's also a lot of people that are not here.
Yeah.
So even if you take ship owners and charterers, there's a lot of ship owners and charterers that are not here, and there's a lot of misalignment still. So there's also a stakeholder engagement to be done on the nearest front. But we concentrated on the two fronts of the carrot. That was the carrot from the customers. So how do we create a bigger pull from the consumers and the customers? And we had the sort of two. There's the end consumer, but there's also the supply chain. So the retailers, the commodity traders, and the logistics providers in the supply chain, they already now see a business opportunity in providing what we termed the green labeling. So how do we make a business out of providing a greener alternative? That's already happening in certain trades within containerization, but also within some dry cargo cargo owners. So how do we then increase that pull? And we thought that a green labeling would be an excellent choice. That also requires that we have reporting systems that you can trust, so that if anybody claims to be greener than the other party, it has to be verified data and not just greenwashing. And then the other side of the coin is is towards the regulators, where we, as Andreas was saying it, we also believe that we should use the existing infrastructure. I mean, we have the IMO. It is very difficult for any of us to imagine that the IMO will not be at the centerpiece of any global regulation. I think in this room we all want global regulation and not regional or country-based regulation. However, in order to achieve a more effective IMO, we need to put more pressure on our governments. So national ship owners associations, they play a central role here, but the engagement with governments, not only where we operate or where we are situated, but also where our flags are and where our ships trade, we need to put pressure on for the governments to make IMO effective. Because it's not IMO that is inherently ineffective, it's the governments that do not ratify the rules that are ineffective. And then coming full circle to the consumers again, we think we cannot wait for an international marketing drive. We need to again engage nationally, and it doesn't matter whether some nations or countries are ahead of others, as long as we start influencing the consumers, rebranding the industry and telling what we are doing, positive things, and creating the pull for better solutions. So that's all nice thinking, and when we got to the concrete points, what was then the action, and there's a lot of mapping to be done. I think there's a lot of understanding on how the IMO system works that we may know on the surface, but I don't think we all appreciate how difficult it is to work through it. So there's mapping, there's education, and then there's simply getting people together to work on different things. But we think that the national associations play a central role in this, together with ICS and then ultimately the IMO.
Klaus, thank you. Just a quick question on this. What struck me about the conversation, the discussion around demand drivers was there's a real sort of focus sensed on you can't just say we're going to do. There has to be market incentives and there has to be transparency. And for the consumer, you give them a choice. This is what the fuel would typically cost. This is what a green branded fuel will cost. And you let them make that choice, and you let that choice drive the onward consumption. I thought that was actually quite right and quite powerful.
And a comment to that, because there's a chicken and egg situation, because no consumer will pay until they get something they can trust is greener. So in the beginning, of course, we do not have the zero fuel. So how do you get to the situation where they can actually really contribute towards something that is the right solution? But in the meantime, we just have to push it, nudge it along. And I think actually this model or the stakeholder engagement is relevant no matter whether we talk about a cost to the industry or whether we try to raise a fund for the industry. The stakeholder engagement will be exactly the same no matter where we end up. So we need to act.
Excellent. Everyone, please join me in thanking our second panel on decarbonization, Deanna, Klaus, Andreas, Bud, and Randy. Thank you very much.